our goal is to discuss three main aspects of the memory of German crimes in Poland. How this memory looks like, what do scholars and public know, and how they think about it. This will be the topic of our first panel. The legal consequences of German crimes in Poland, in Poland and in Germany. First and foremost, this is criminal persecution and compensation claims, but it is also the quest for addressing history with proper terms. Unfortunately, Judge Jan Robert von Renesse, the protagonist of the ghetto labor compensation claims, cannot join us in this discussion. He did not get the permission to speak by his court in Essen. The museumization, that is the presentation of these crimes in museums in Poland and in Germany. Both Germany and Poland are societies that consider historical memory to be important, and each continues building new museums. And we have representatives of 4 institutions from both countries here who will discuss these issues with us. And now we will start with the first panel chaired by a tour's organizer of the conference, Professor Dr. Stefan Genstedt. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Nahama, for this very warm welcome, and also a welcome from me. I have the pleasure to chair this panel dedicated to the German knowledge of the crimes committed in Poland, and we'll have a look at school books, at historical research, at current German-Polish sentiments and thoughts about one another, and finally on Polish politics of spreading historical knowledge in Germany. To follow this line of thought, I'd suggest a small change in the order of our presentations, with Daniel Breving and Agnieszka Wada changing places. We'll hear the presentations one by one and only then have a discussion, which of course will be opened also to the audience. But let me first very shortly introduce the panelists. Dr. Daniel Breving is a scholar at the Technical University Aachen, the Rheinisch-Westfälische Technische Hochschule, and has held prestigious fellowships, for instance, at the USHMM, Washington, the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, and at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. As a historian, he has written his PhD on German crimes against Polish civilians, a book which was published originally in German and last year also in Polish by the Institute Zachodny in Poznan. His study was widely appreciated in Germany and Poland and received several distinctions. We have Dr. Agnieszka Wada. She is since 2019 Deputy Director of the Deutsches Polen Institute, the German Institute for Polish Affairs in Darmstadt, and previously worked at the Institut Spraw Publicznych, the Institute for Public Affairs in Warsaw. As a political scientist, she has worked on German-Polish relations, on Polish foreign policy, and the country's neighbors. Among many other publications, she is also the author of the annual opinion survey on German-Polish relations. Hanna Radziejowska is one of the 2 Polish colleagues here in Berlin, and probably best described as curator and organizer of cultural and museum projects. She has worked for the Warsaw Rising Museum, the History Meeting House, and the Copernicus Science Center in Warsaw, but since several years is active in German-Polish cultural dialogue. Thus, in 2017 and 18, she was the head of the Polish Institute here in Berlin, and 1 year later returned to head the branch of the Pilecki Institute here in Berlin, located at the Brandenburg Gate. Professor Dr. Igor Konkulewski is since 2018 the director of the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences here in Berlin. And he's also a professor of history at the University of Olsztyn. In his career, he has worked, among others, at King's College London, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, where I had the pleasure to be his colleague. He was expert advisor for the Poland Museum and for the Museum of Polish History in Warsaw, with his area of expertise being early modern history and Polish-Jewish-German relations. And what's more, he is the coordinator for the German-Polish History Schoolbook, and that's what he will now speak about. So Igor, please go ahead with your presentation. You have slides prepared, and we're really looking forward to seeing it and to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan, for the introduction. Thank you very much to all the organizers for inviting me to be here today with you. As Stefan mentioned, I'm going to focus on the Polish-German textbook for history and to give in my talk a bit broader context on the so-called Polish-German textbook dialogue. In the age of extremes, as some historians call the 20th century, we had to do with two opposing tendencies. On the one hand, the 20th century was the age of extreme violence, two world wars, genocide, and numerous local military conflicts, as well as forced mass migrations. On the other hand, the 20th century saw development of the world peace movement, creation of influential international institutions, NGOs, and grassroots initiatives developing international dialogue, including the history textbook dialogue. Already post-World War I trauma brought about the realization that school history textbooks might be a basic instrument for the construction of a national identity, but also a potential tool for producing confrontational and xenophobic attitudes. As early as 1919, French teachers attending the conference in Tours called for a review of school history teaching that they saw to be a potential source of conflicts between nations. In the late 1920s and early 30s, the influence of the content of school history teaching on international relations came to the attention of world congresses of historians in Oslo and The Hague. This awareness gave rise to one of the most fascinating phenomena of the 20th century, namely attempts to establish international dialogue on history textbooks. The first Franco-German and Polish-German attempts at initiating a revision of the content of school textbooks for history go back to the years 1935 and 1937. The first years after World War II, marked by Cold War confrontation and post-war trauma, were not conducive to any dialogue. However, on the western side of the Iron Curtain, the very first Franco-German talks and bilateral agreements regarding the content of school textbooks for history began in the early 1950s. The first result of these talks was the publication in 1951 of the Franco-German Agreement on controversial issues in European history between 1789 and 1933. Establishing the German-Polish dialogue on history textbooks required more time. It was not possible until the change in the global politics in the 1960s. However, the real breakthrough was brought about by activities of the joint Polish-German Textbook Commission of Historians and Geographers, established in 1972. Professor Gotthold Rode, a German member of the joint German Textbook Commission, stated 5 years later, quote, "Those who could foresee back in 1945 that Polish and German historians and geographers descending from the war generation would be bargaining inflexibly but to the point and kindly, all collegially, in the German language in Warsaw over the possibility to revise school textbooks and history lessons would have been regarded as mentally insane," end quote. The dialogue on history textbook between Poland and Germany entered a new phase after the political changes in the 1990s. The main goal of the Polish-German Textbook Commission has recently become an ambitious attempt to create a transnational textbook narrative. The initiation of the so-called German-Polish history textbook project was possible due to decisions made at the political level after Poland's accession to the European Union in 2004. The model for the Polish-German project was the Franco-German 3-volume textbook series called Histoire, Geschichte, addressed to the students of the last 3 grades of a high school, the first volume of which was published in 2006. In the same year, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, put forward the idea of a similar German-Polish project. In 2008, the Polish and German Ministers of Foreign Affairs entrusted the task of creating the project's framework to the Joint Textbook Commission and established a project's work group composed of representatives of the scholarly world and governmental institutions from both countries. The aim of the project was the publication of a school history textbook addressed to the middle school students in the age between 11 and 15 years old. That is the younger age group than the French-German textbooks users. The textbook in Polish and German language version is identical in terms of their content and graphic design. It's also important to note that the Polish-German textbook project is not concerned with producing additional teaching materials, but its final product is to be a state-approved history textbook compliant with the country's curricula. Moreover, its content should not focus only on history of Poland and Germany or Polish-German relations, but cover all periods of European and world history, from prehistory and ancient times until the beginning of the 21st century. In 2012, the project entered a new phase when private publishers in Poland and Germany responsible for its realization in both language versions were selected. The editorial and publishing process of the Polish-German textbook series, Europe, Our History, so the title of the series, took almost 8 years. Volume 1, From Prehistory to the End of the Middle Ages, came out 2016, and Volume 4, so the final volume from covering the period from 1918 until today, came out just 3 months ago in the summer 2020. The implementation of the Franco-German and Polish-German history textbook projects might be seen as a testimony to the need for transnational textbooks as instruments of the European integration process. However, transnational textbooks projects, though mainly limited to narratives of the difficult history of the 20th century, are also being published outside the EU. Quite often, they are carried out against an unfavorable political climate produced by state authorities and their policies. This is the case with the majority projects that do not intend to create a shared or joint transnational narrative. Instead, they are limited to the publication of additional materials for history teaching, or they compile different national narratives as a kind of, so to say, record of disparities. The most known example here is a pioneering textbook called Learning Each Other's Historical Narrative, Palestinians and Israelis, published by Peace Research Institute in the Middle East in 2003. Now I'm coming to the second part of my presentation, which is focused already on the content of Volume 4 related to World War II. So, Tal, please, can we go to slide 1? And in this part of my presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on challenges and chances created by the series of Europe, of our history. So, point one, challenge, translation. Appropriate translation has been one of major challenges posed to the project. And appropriate does not mean a literal translation, so to the letter, but rather in line with the spirit of the language and its cultural context. Often, however, we have encountered some very serious limits and problems. At such points, there appeared the need to translate in intercultural rather than textual or purely linguistic terms. To illustrate the point, let me take one example related to a historical and geographical orientation of the map of Europe and ask the question, where is it precisely that Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are situated? Is it Eastern, East Central, or Central Eastern Europe? Ost-Mitteleuropa, East Central Europe, is the option chosen for the German language version, whereas Europa Środkowo-Wschodnia, Central East Europe, is relevant for the Polish textbook series. As for Poland and other countries east of the Elbe River, the notion Central East Europe corresponds with their cultural European identity, whereas for most of Germans, the above-mentioned countries are situated rather more to the eastern part of Europe. Another example is the term Vertreibung, mostly known in the phrase Flucht und Vertreibung, or flight and expulsion, which is related to the forced migrations of the Germans and Volksdeutsche from the former Eastern German territories and various Eastern and Central European countries after 1944-45. Instead of the word Vertreibung, we mostly use the less emotionally connoted terms, which might be translated into English as forced resettlements or forced displacements. The same term is also used in relation to the forced displacements of the Polish population from the former Eastern Polish territories annexed by the Soviet Union in 1945. However, in Polish and German versions, we explain the meaning of the phrase Flucht und Vertreibung, in Polish ucieczka I wypędzenie, and its significance for the post-war German culture of memory. Point two, chance, complexity of European perspectives. History teaching in West Europe, including Germany, rather neglects history of East Central Europe. The German-Polish project tries to break away from the Westernization of the European history narrative and intends to broaden the outlook of young German students on Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, it points out certain aspects of West European history that are rarely included in Polish curricula. Therefore, in volume 4 of the textbook Europe, Our History, we tried to present similarities and differences of the Nazi German occupation in various Western and Eastern European countries, paying attention, for example, to a daily life in Copenhagen, Paris, and Warsaw, but also to a specific dimension of the war of annihilation in Eastern Europe. Thus, we followed, to some extent, into footsteps of the authors and curators of the core exhibition of World War II Museum in Gdańsk, who also focus on the different aspects of daily life in some capitals of European countries under the German occupation and stress specific characteristics of World War II in Western and Eastern Europe. Can we go to slide 2, please? However, we also attempted to present more extensively the fact that a great part of Poland since September 1939 to June 1941 and Baltic countries from 1940 to 1941 was exposed to the terror of the Soviet occupation. Consequently, we were able to present not only facts important for the Polish curricula and Polish culture of memory, such as the execution of the Polish officers in Katyn in 1940, but also scenes from the daily life in Lviv under the Soviet occupation. It is obvious that history of military and international conflicts plays a major role in the constructing of national identities. By highlighting history of conflicts, we are more clearly able to differentiate between us and others. Consequently, we can strengthen a sense of belonging to our own community to the detriment of aliens or strangers. This kind of narrative still prevails in many national history textbooks. Things become more complicated when we look at the history of borderlands. Borderlands have always constituted interesting laboratories of multiculturalism produced by transnational patterns and cultural transfers. Therefore, we decided to introduce in our Polish-German textbook a subchapter called Regions which Divide and Connect, that mostly draws on history of the Upper Silesia, Górny Śląsk, Oberschlesien, in which Polish, German, and Czech cultures over many centuries created a synthesis escaping from the narrow-minded modern definitions of nationality and the idea of national state. Thus, in volume 4, it has been easier for us to explain such phenomena as Deutsche Volksliste in the Upper Silesia and Pomerellen, Pomorze, and drafting of Polish male youth from these regions to the Wehrmacht. Can we go to the next slide, please? Point 3, challenge: how to present the Holocaust for Polish and German school students. We decided to present the Holocaust as a uniting human experience in extremity, providing universal truths for all humans. You can certainly recognize that we assumed here the perspective presented by a Holocaust survivor, Austrian psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl. Like in other chapters on World War II, we put here also extensive fragments from primary sources written by children or iconographic sources presenting Jewish children in the ghettos to make the narrative of the textbook more meaningful for young people nowadays. However, except for positive sides of the human nature, which found its expression in saving of persecuted Jews, we tried to touch upon different approaches to the Holocaust of the non-Jewish population under the German occupation, including the collaboration with the Nazis or active contribution to the Shoah. Point 4, the textbook compositional features and didactic components. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, no, sorry. One slide before. Yeah. So, Tal, could you please switch back to the previous slide? Sorry. Is it possible for you, Tal, to switch back to the previous slide? Okay, I assume Tal is working on it now. I can't see my presentation. Yeah, exactly. This is the right one. Both the textbook graphic design and the proportions, it means 60% of the main author text and 40% of the didactic content, that is primary written and iconographical sources, exercises, tests, and recurring sections, constitute important characteristics of the Polish-German textbook for history. Let me present here some examples from the chapter about World War II. One of the important didactic elements in each volume is the section called Past in the Present, that demonstrates different aspects of the culture of memory and commemoration of the past in different countries. Here, we present different forms of commemoration of the Holocaust. The monument of the so-called empty shoes on the bank of the river of Danube in Budapest, the Hall of Names in Yad Vashem, the so-called Stolpersteine in German towns, and the Bełżec commemoration place. Besides, in the section Past in the Present, we also try to present personal stories in which the experiences from World War II have a huge impact on lives of people until today. Here, a story of a Belarusian girl who was, as a forced labor, Zwangsarbeiterin, working in her teens in the Third Reich. The section Past in the present should prove that history lasts in the lives of individuals as well as in the contemporary public space and landscape that surrounds us. Now, can we switch to the next one? Tal, please. Yes, thank you. Of course, putting only some illustrations of the monuments commemorating the Holocaust would not make sense without learning how to analyze monuments and their message. Therefore, in each big chapter, we have produced the so-called Methodenseite or Warsztat Historica section that might be translated into English as thinking and questioning like a historian. In this case, here, we present the history of the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, asking questions with regard to its genesis and message. In the section Thinking and Questioning like a Historian, we generally attempt to show how to analyze different sorts of primary and secondary sources, including featured films. Here, the example relating to the comparison of two acclaimed movies, Like is Beautiful, a comedy drama directed by and starring Roberto Benigni from 1997, and The Pianist, a war biographical drama film produced and directed by Roman Polanski from 2002. Can we go to the last slide, please, now? Yeah. Another example of a recurring section is the section called Points of View, which includes opinions of historians or public intellectuals related to the same historical event, process, or a person involved in it, but often interpreted or presented in a different way. So, for example, we juxtapose two opinions in this section, one expressed by German historian Stefan Leinstedt in his book, Der Kern des Holocaust, published 2007, and another opinion by the German president, Richard von Weizsäcker, from his speech in the Bundestag in 2085, on the problem how much average Germans knew about the Holocaust during World War II. Due to juxtaposing two opinions on the same topic, we can see different ways used by a historian and the politicians to talk about the responsibility for the Holocaust. Thus, the editors and authors of the Polish-German textbooks are able to teach history based on this so-called multi-perspective approach. The main goal of this approach is to convince students at school, but also the history teachers, that the main task and the goal of history is not only to present how it really happened in the abstract past that is disconnected from the present day, but we prove that history is also a kind of a narrative that might be told in many different ways. And this seems to be the most important message for each project of a transnational history textbook. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm also sorry by some technical problems with my PowerPoint presentation caused mostly by me. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor, for this wonderful presentation. I always enjoy this cool book, not only because I'm quoted there, but well, first of all, I like the optical impression, and then I like the content, and I like the way you are presenting history here. But well, we'll discuss that later. Now, I would like Daniel Breving to give his presentation. I'm not quite sure, Daniel, whether you have a slideshow or something like that. No, you don't. Okay, so please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to all the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this crisp 20-minute talk about German research on Nazi violence in occupied Poland. When I accepted this kind offer to give the presentation, I should have thought twice, I guess, given the sheer amount of research which which makes it impossible to give anything close to an exhaustive overview. So I decided to mainly concentrate on more recent research on the topic, all of which was produced after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This gives me the opportunity to dive a little deeper into specific research areas, point out the interconnectedness of different approaches, touch on some of the more current debates. Since the 1990s, it was certainly the violence against the Jewish population of Poland and Eastern Europe that finally, and after a remarkable time lag, lay at the structural center of the research output. The end of communist rule in Eastern Europe opened up new research opportunities. Drawing upon hitherto unexplored archival material, scholars of the Holocaust have since focused on the implementation of genocidal policies at the actual sites of mass murder, turning away from the debates on the decision-making process within the Berlin central agencies. By now, a number of regional studies cover nearly the entire occupied Polish territories and sketch a rather complex picture of numerous agencies with various motivations perpetrating violent measures against local Jews with utter brutality. The fundamental findings of this nuanced scholarship are threefold. First, and centrally, Holocaust research emphasized that the origins of mass violence may not exclusively be grasped in top-down models. Mass violence against Polish Jews developed as a complex interplay of impulses from central agencies and initiatives from the regional and local level. Second, the unfolding of violence was thus not solely based upon intentional strategic planning and deliberate calculus, but also, above all, was triggered by decisions made by various organizations of the occupation apparatus in situ. Third, researchers have come to agree on one point. Ideology is not sufficient to explain mass violence. Harald Welzer reminded us that both mindset and behavior are only loosely connected to each other. And Christian Geulen argued convincingly that racist utopias don't always insist on their violent realization, if we think, for example, about South Africa. Extremely violent and destructive events therefore call for a multi-causal analysis. Thus, reconstructing the political, social, and economic contexts, scholars focused on situational dynamics and highlighted specific local interests as pragmatic motives for mass violence. In sum, these broader trends of Holocaust research shift our understanding of the final solution away from deterministic linearity and stringent systematics, underscoring instead the procedural character of what Karl Schleunis has once coined the twisted road to Auschwitz. These Holocaust studies were highly influential as they changed our understanding of German-occupied Eastern Europe and Poland by pointing to the structural relevance and omnipresence of anti-Semitic violence. Holocaust scholars have sketched occupied Poland as a specific area for the perpetration of numerous accounts of anti-Semitic violence. It was argued that this specific area was formed through a constantly changing constellation of both transgressions and restraints that created a framework in which German personnel in occupied Poland operated. The decisive parameters of this area were set by a structural transgression from above that turned violence into a cornerstone of the German future in which the Volksgemeinschaft would rule over a racially homogeneous occupied Poland and Eastern Europe in general. Holocaust research has convincingly argued that this transgression from above opened up chances for violent initiatives at the local and regional level, which were used widely within the German occupation society. Violence against Jews was not a deviant behavior, but could instead meet the collective norms of German occupation society. On the other hand, though, Holocaust research has also pointed to the fact that not every kind of violence against Jews was necessarily accepted and allowed. Rather, scholars have highlighted a number of imperatives and restrictions that at first sight would appear to be highly inconsistent. We are faced with a closely meshed set of rules that all German actors were subjected to, specific red lines that marked the ambiguous border between allowed violent behavior and prohibited violence. That way, violence was supposed to be channeled into regulated forms of action in order both to avoid independent excesses, or Ausschweifungen as they were called, and to secure a stable normative frame that would avoid, or that would prevent, an anarchic escalation of violence. But the newer research on perpetrators of Nazi violence has clearly shown that this normative framework most certainly did not mirror the reality on the ground. Within the specific milieus of occupied Poland, with their safeguarding comradeship, these normative red lines could easily be crossed by various actors in deliberate acts of self-authorization. Holocaust scholars have argued that in order to understand German violence against Polish Jews, we need to take a closer look at the specific areas of action that were formed by both normative transgression and attempts to regulate from above, and the self-authorization of German personnel on the ground that tried to define on its own what was permitted, prohibited, and ordered in a specific situation. According to post-1989 Holocaust scholarship, this combination of intention and situation produced a constantly high level of violence that left behind millions of dead. While Holocaust research mainly focused on German perpetrators of the Holocaust, the last years have witnessed an interesting turn in scholarly perspective. Donald Bloxham once neatly summarized these new approaches in the following way. I quote, "In German-occupied Europe, others than Germans killed Jews, and Germans killed others than Jews." I will use the remainder of my paper to dive a little deeper into these two scholarly perspectives. Others than Germans killed Jews. This points to a new interpretation of the Holocaust as a German-driven European project in which the indigenous population participated for numerous reasons. The focus of the scholarly interest shifted away from German actors to the local non-Jewish population. It all started with a debate on Jan Tomasz Gross' book on the massacre of Jews in Jedwabne that were murdered by their Polish neighbors. Since then, both scholars and the general public have spent much attention on Polish grassroots anti-Semitism and the collaboration of ordinary Poles in the Holocaust. Scholars like Jan Grabowski or Grzegorz Rosolinski-Liebe published important studies that are at the center of a heated debate. Apparently, the reality of German occupation was characterized by interaction between German occupiers and the Polish civilian population. Grabowski makes his case by analyzing the fate of Polish Jews that went into hiding. While it is certainly true that the help of the local Polish population was a necessary precondition for the hiding, Grabowski compellingly argues that without the help from Polish informers, German SS and police forces would not have been so successful in hunting down the hidden Jews. Now, I would argue that these studies are so interesting because they transcend the rather rigid dichotomy of occupiers and occupants by investigating zones of cooperation. They fundamentally changed our understanding of everyday life under German rule, which was apparently much more complex than we liked to believe. Everything I have told you to this point is the story of scholarly progress. Finally, after years of carefully forgetting about the fate of Jews under Nazi rule, the Holocaust is at the center of both public memory and research. But I would argue that this boom in Holocaust research inherently produces blind spots, since it reduces the overall complex of Nazi violence to the Holocaust. Jan Philipp Reemtsma once spoke of a tendency to make something invisible by highlighting the extremes. While the Holocaust, as the undoubtedly most extreme form of Nazi violence, takes center stage, various other forms of violence against other groups seemingly fade out. This brings me back to Donald Bloxham. While it is surely true that others than Germans killed Jews, scholarly research tends to forget that Germans also killed others than Jews. Neither the broader public nor historians seem to have a larger interest in this matter. Only euthanasia, the mass murder of both mentally and physically disabled people, mostly German, has attracted public and scholarly interest similar to that in the Holocaust. We should not exaggerate, though. Those who insinuate that Polish suffering would be deliberately excluded from Western discourses certainly get carried away in their critical approach. At least a couple of violent events received scholarly attention early on. First, Martin Broschardt highlighted already in 1960 the murder of the political, cultural, and intellectual elites of the Second Polish Republic in 1939-1940 that was executed as a preventive measure to eliminate all potential cause of a future resistance. Second, the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 that left the city in ruins and took the lives of almost 200,000 inhabitants. Hans von Kranhals documented these crimes since the late 1950s. However, I would argue that there is a complex historical landscape that stretches between these two events, and it is certainly no exaggeration to suggest that this is a landscape that, in the words of Stefan Malinowski, historians frequently overflew but rarely set foot on. Christian Gerlach has recently reminded us that Nazi Germany was in fact an extremely violent society, where various population groups became victims of massive physical violence, in which governmental organizations and diverse social groups participated for a multitude of reasons. This is especially true for occupied Poland, where non-Jewish civilians too were targeted as victims of different waves of Nazi violence. This history of violence has been touched very rarely by German and Western scholars in general. Only in the past decade or so have researchers begun to trace the subject of German atrocities against ethnic Poles. Their different approaches were heavily influenced by Holocaust research that I have outlined before. Holocaust scholars established a pattern of how to understand Nazi violence in general. As the racial political core of Nazi ideology, the final solution of the Jewish question certainly reflects the patterns of other processes and contexts of Nazi persecution and mass violence. They too should not be understood as the exclusive result of a consistent implementation of intentional measures. I would like to highlight 4 different approaches that provide valuable insight into the logics and dynamics of German violence against the Polish civilian population. They touch on questions of continuity, ideology, war, and contexts. First, let me start with the question of historical continuity and the prehistory of Nazi violence against the Polish civilian population. According to Dieter Pohl, there is a certain arbitrariness among scholars. In the last couple of years, different lines of continuity were drawn. Nazi violence was directly or indirectly linked to the German-French War in 1871, the colonial massacres at the turn of the century, and the killings of Belgian civilians in 1941. More promising proved to be the analysis of German-Polish post-war fightings after World War I. Scholars were able to identify continuities in personnel and perception. Many leading Nazi officials took part in these post-war fightings, especially in Upper Silesia, and developed a certain image of the Poles that proved to be a catalyst for violence after 1939. The perception of Poles as hideous, barbaric, and violent enemies to the German people took ground. And it was this conception of the enemy that allowed German perpetrators to frame their actions as purely reactionary and defensive measures. On a scholarly level, this newer approach to continuities tells quite a different story than Polish historiography under communist rule used to tell. You're probably all familiar with the line of argument. A specific German Drang nach Osten, push to the east, already emerged in the Middle Ages, intermingled in the 19th century with racial ideological stereotypes, and culminated after Hitler's seizure of power in the plan to eradicate Poland and the Polish people from the map. Certainly, Germans had centuries of a specific form of chauvinistic Eastern Orientalism to fall back upon, but this line of continuity is too hermetic, linear, and one-dimensional. Second, scholars have re-evaluated the ideological foundations of Nazi rule in occupied Poland. While for decades, different historians such as Wolfgang Jakobmeier or Jochen Böhler have pointed to the relevance of Nazi anti-Slavism, John Connelly convincingly argued recently that anti-Slavism obscures the flexible and opportunistic relationships of Nazi Germany to Eastern Europe in general. Miriam Arani and Doris Bergen have since highlighted the contours of a specific German anti-Polonism by analyzing German Gräuel propaganda at the eve of World War II. Here, the so-called Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans, were portrayed as helpless victims of Polish violence, an image that directly connected to the perception as violent barbarians, which was established after World War I. Third, the German invasion of Poland in September 1939 received much scholarly attention since the early 2000s. What made this war so exceptional were the atrocities directed against the Polish civilian population. Tens of thousands fell victim to numerous violent actions. While these facts are undisputed, the historians diverge over the question of how to best explain this wave of violence. While Alex Rossino suggested to focus on the great importance of ideological factors, such as the widespread racism among German troops, Jochen Böhler sees an interplay of motivational, situational, and psychological factors. He argues that the German troops were paranoid, that Polish partisans lurked everywhere, and these fears were repeatedly reinforced by the military leadership. Thus, anxiety was a main factor. As a result, this psychological condition, argues Böhler, meant that the idea of preventive action as well as revenge for own losses triggered acts of violence against Polish civilians. Dieter Pohl, on the other hand, emphasizes the absence of controls, that is, the lack of sustained protest within the Wehrmacht and in the international public arena to this German violence. All of those studies highlight the importance of the early phase of German occupation, where patterns of behavior were established that foreshadowed many of the violence yet to erupt in the following years. Fourth and finally, scholars have pointed out that the violence against the Polish civilian population is intimately connected to the nuanced long, middle, and short-term goals of German rule in Poland and Eastern Europe in general. In the long term, German policymakers targeted a racial restructuring of the entire European continent and particularly of the occupied Polish territories. Culminating in the Generalplan Ost, an indispensable part of these plans was the expulsion and rapid decimation of the indigenous population of Eastern Europe and Poland. In the medium term, priority was given to the maximal exploitation of the Polish territories to fuel Germany's economy's increasingly desperate war effort with foodstuffs, labor, and raw materials. In the short term, the German occupation apparatus reacted to varying military, economic, and political constraints. In particular, the formation of an ever stronger and active Polish resistance movement that has emerged as an imminent threat for the maintenance of German order within the strategically important territories of occupied Poland. Against this background, historians have interpreted German violence against Polish civilians as something that unfolded within the context of these different time perspectives by the entanglement of warfare, racial restructuring, economic, agrarian, and security policies. The inherent conflicts and opposing interests within the different branches of the occupation apparatus caused numerous discrepancies and contradictions that resulted in crucial regional variations in both the intensity and the focus of violence over time. German violence against ethnic Poles was thus remarkably diverse and uncoordinated. There was no grand design for the killing of Polish civilians. It was rather, and this sums up current research, a complex process in which several campaigns of mass murder were implemented on the regional and local level. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Daniel, for this impressive overview. And I know that the challenge to sum up only the research of the last 30 years is almost impossible. And I'm quite sure we'll have something to discuss about later on. But now I would like to move on to Agnieszka Wada, who will speak about German, Polish mutual perceptions and probably also historical problems in mutual perceptions. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be with you. And as we now heard, and we had to listen a lot, and we always during events like to a little bit more interactive part. So now a short exercise for you watching us. Before you follow my presentation, I won't read. I will try to somehow describe for you some facts. Short exercise for you guys. Please answer yourself a question. Those of you who are Germans or not Poles, please answer yourself the question, what do you have in your head when you hear the word Poland or Poles, right? Name 3 associations. 3, right? You hear the word Poles or Poland. And those of you who are Poles or non-Germans, please answer the question, what do you have in mind when comes to your head when you hear the word Germany or Germans, right? 3 associations. Please think about it and we'll come back to that later on, but please be aware what you have thought about when I ask the question. And now coming to my presentation, because it's also about associations, it's all about public opinion. I would like to present for you the study called Polish-German Barometer. That's a questionnaire, the public opinion questionnaire, and I would like to share with you what we have researched. The Polish-German Barometer is a project that collects regularly public opinions of the Poles and the Germans. It has been started already many years ago, actually in the year 2000, as the Institute of Public Affairs in Warsaw studied the public perception of Poland abroad and of Germany, France, and Spain in Poland, but only the Polish-German research stayed, and we repeated the questionnaires in the following years when I joined the Institute of Public Affairs in Warsaw. Now when I'm in the Deutsches Polen-Institut in Darmstadt, I'm also doing it for both institutions actually. So that's a public opinion study. Short to the methodology so that you know who is asked and what it's all about. It's a face-to-face study, so people are asked at their homes. 1,000 respondents in both countries. It is regularly done during the same month, let's say, so that it's really comparable. This year, it was in February, so really just before the pandemic has really started. And the authors develop the questions, repeat the questions that have been already asked, and formulate some new questions. And of course, well-known public opinion companies do the research for us in Germany and in Poland. So that's the methodology. And now you need to remember what you have named a couple of minutes before, right? What association did you have 5 minutes ago when I asked the question? Because that's the question that we ask usually to the respondents. It's an open question. And why I'm starting with it? Because our topic is history today, and the answers on this question show very clearly what the Poles and the Germans think about each other. So first, the Polish associations. Each person could have 3 associations with Germany and with the Germans. So you get maximum 3,000 of answers. Of course, not everybody names 3 things. And now you need to collect them a little bit to group them. And here is what we had, what we could collect. We grouped it, and the first and the biggest group of the Polish associations with Germany or the Germans are the associations connected with history. So with our topic today. And they are very negative associations, as you can see. So aggressor, war, occupier, occupation, Third Reich, Hitler, Wehrmacht, SS, Jews, murders, shootings, Auschwitz, concentration camps, Holocaust, ghettos, then some places as Westerplatte or Warsaw Uprising as an event during the Second World War, Nazism, fascism. So all the words connected actually mainly with the latest war, not just with the Polish-German history, but with really the latest war. That's the biggest group, 30% of all associations, not of the respondents, but of all associations that were given. Then we have some neutral ones connected with countries, so that's Germany's Polish neighbor, etc. Then we have also something that is very connected to the history, because Germany is perceived as a prosperous country, as a country where there are the best highways and great solid cars and best brands, very expensive ones. And the German products are so good and the quality is so high, and everything is innovative. There are very rich people there, economy is developing really well, and people just live better there in Germany. That's 13% of all Polish associations with Germany. So why it's connected to history? Because of course, historically, the Poles always looked to the West and looked how is the life in Germany, in the Western Europe. And that was the image. And I must tell you that when we compare what has changed during the years in those associations, I can tell you the group is smaller and smaller, because these historical associations, right, it was so rich there and it was so great. is nowadays not really so much present in the Polish public opinion, because we see how German economy is today like, and we travel there as Poles, so it's not just this dream, but also the reality. So it's no more so the Poles are no more so much in love in the German economy. And we have something on politics and mutual relations. There are 12% of all associations. Angela Merkel is here named quite often, and some associations to Polish-German relations. Germany is called as a partner, economic partner, but also the difficult relations are stay here, and that Germans discriminate Poland, and they look over Poland. Then we have labor associations with labor market, with tourism and culture and country of law and order. So everything is so perfect in Germany, but the last association is a very small group. It used to be bigger, so rather positive associations. And now, because our focus is on history, so I wanted to show you what are the relations among these associations. And here you can see what has changed in the recent years, and how different are the groups. And here you see the all negative associations with the Polish-German history are not just a bigger group, the biggest group, but also the number of those associations has recently grown. And it's really not just a small number of associations that is now bigger than it was in 2018 or 16, but the group is really bigger than 2016, for example. So we may discuss it later on why it's that, but it's a very, very clear. And now, those of you who named the associations with Poland, right? Those of you who thought about, okay, what do I have in mind when I hear the word Poland or the Poles? You are now asked. So they are the answers of the German respondents, what they told us. And here you see the difference. What we had on the Polish slide, or at the first place, history. Here we have tourism and culture. It's of course great that the Germans have something like tourism, culture, and all positive associations in mind when they think about Poland, because that's all about beautiful cities and landscapes and mountains and great, beautiful churches and holidays, places for holidays, etc. And also the Polish food is mentioned. So very positive or neutral associations at the first place, but not history. Remember, and please follow me to find out where is history. Not on the third or fourth place. Here we see that some characters, features of character are quite high on the German associations list. So how the Poles are like, they are friendly, reliable, funny, hardworking. They are very helpful, welcoming, unbureaucratic, and so on. Then the workers, the Polish workers, are very, very good. That's mainly cleaning staff and people working at home, but they work pretty well, as the Germans think. Then we have some associations to the how is the economy like in Poland, and here we think we find two groups actually, as you see on the one hand, it's modern and it's great economic growth. On the other hand, it's cheap cigarettes and cheap cars, and actually cost of living are lower, and it's not as well developed as our German economy. And now we can see where we can find history, all the historical associations. On the nearly last place, 7% of all associations are connected with history, and it's not just the Second World War, of course, as well. Hitler and Wehrmacht and Second World War as war is mentioned, Holocaust, Auschwitz, and concentration camps, but also some other issues connected with the newest history, like Warsaw Pact or communism, are here among this group. So we see a big difference here, right? When you see the numbers all together, you can see how far away is history on the German mental map compared to the Polish. And we can discuss what does it mean, but for me, the main finding of that is that when a Pole and a German meet, they have something else in mind starting their conversation. And that might be a problem in the communication or for the communication. And I can observe it in many of my research projects that it is a problem, that the mental map is so different. So you have indeed some difficulties or challenges while communicating, because history plays such a different role in both societies. Now, very shortly, I wanted to show you how far the history influences also the relationship with the neighbor. We always regularly ask the question, what is your attitude towards Poles or Germans? So they can, the respondents can answer on the scale from 1 to 5, and the scales show the Germans or Polish friendly feelings towards the other nation, or rather dislike for Germans or Poles. And what you can see here is how it has changed during the last years. And the blue lines are always means the Polish answer, the gray ones the German answer. And what was very clear till 2018 was that the Polish I like the Germans answers were always always, or the numbers were higher than the Germans numbers. So the Poles answered quite often, or even more and more often, I like the Germans, then the Germans answered I like the Poles. You can see the blue line went nearly to 60 to 56% in 2018, when the German line went to 29%. But you can see here the difference, but also when you add the I like and I don't like answers, you see there is a kind of a hole, because on the German side, because the Germans were somewhere in the middle. Oh, I don't like the Poles, but I don't dislike the Poles neither. So there was a group of Germans who said, well, neither nor, right? I'm not really decided. Were the neutral feelings, or just, oh, well, it doesn't matter for me actually. Why we concentrate on the Polish answer so much in our study is that, of course, for the Poles with this very tragic history with Germany, it was very difficult to answer the question, do I like the Germans? Do I really like the Germans, the nation of occupiers, and the nation that destroyed our country or even killed people from my family. So answering is I like the Germans was already a big symbol, a big issue, a big sign. Yes, the Poles really are not forgetting the war, but can live with that, right? They can be friends with the Germans, don't have problems with that. And now we can see that in the last years, in the recent time, the numbers are not so high as they used to be. You see all the red circles that I prepared for you, just to show you, to stress the changes that we have here. I assume the running Polish discussions on the Polish-German relations and the role of Germany in the Polish history, a very negative role. That's the why the like answers are not so high as they used to be, because this awareness of what has happened is now, as the study here shows, stronger than it was a few or even 10 years ago. But let's go further, because we have another question that on the other side shows, or the answers show, how close are Poles and Germans, even that the history is so complicated. It's a very typical sociological question. Would you accept somebody in the following rules, right? It's you may know this question from other similar research, and it shows really the distance that two nations that may have some problems, and I'm just, of course, saying it now in our group like that to stress this, that two nations that have very difficult history, how far away are there? How are the real feelings, not just like or dislike, but what does it mean for the normal cooperation? And that's a very simple question. Well, let's imagine person from Germany is your neighbor or your colleague at work or your friend, or enters your family as being your son or daughter-in-law, or it's your direct supervisor or somebody that is the boss in your company. And here we see all the numbers are really high, because, as I said, it's a very typical question that is asked around the world, and we see how are the answers. And here I can say that everything about 70, 80, or even 90% is a very high number, and it shows us that the Poles and the Germans, because as you see there, the both answers are really close, because they have nothing against having a German neighbor on the Polish colleague, or a Polish son-in-law on that the Pole supervises them at work, or that the German takes decision in the company. And here we can see the dynamic of changes of the answers. I know you don't see the numbers. It's done on purpose, because not the numbers exactly, but the dynamic is important. You can just follow the lines a little bit, because what I wanted to show here is how it has changed since the year 2000. You see the year 2000, in the first year as the study was done, the numbers were not as high as today. So Poles had indeed some problems while accepting German person being their supervisor, friend, son-in-law, or somebody with close relations. And of course, the history plays here an enormous role, because let's imagine with this Polish-German history, when you ask, well, how it's about the German person takes decisions for you or let you do something. So of course, for the Polish society, there is a sign, well, we know it already, right, from the history, how it is when the German comes and tells us what to do. And now that's the positive dynamic, that now 90–80% of the poll says, well, I have no problem with that. It's the big change that has happened in the Polish-German public perception. And here you can see the German answers, and why I claim that for the Germans, it's of course easier to accept such something, because the relations was under it. It was not the Pole during the war that told them what to do. So accepting the Pole in these roles were a little bit easier. Still, also here we see a very positive change, however, not as high as in the Polish case. So it means the history still plays a role, but in the very practical terms. When it comes to daily cooperation, the Poles and the Germans have no problems. And now, very quickly, evaluation of the Polish-German relations. As we today focus on history, please, I will just show you here very quickly what are the answers on the very typical question. Well, how do you evaluate the current Polish-German relations? And you can see that 72% of the Poles and 55% of the Germans assess them positively. There are very small numbers, still 1/3 or 14% that assess who assess them negatively. But for our today's discussion, more important are the answers. Why do you assess them like that? So we prepared some answers. So it was not an open question. We prepared 4 or 5 answers for the respondents who told us the relations are good. So we asked why. And here, once more interesting is for us today, the answer, well, actually, there are actions of public authorities and citizens to promote reconciliation because Poles and Germans. And here we can see it's not a big group that answer like that. It's the third answer here on the picture. The biggest group answered, well, actually, we have common economic interests, and that's why the relations are so good. On the other hand, we asked those who told us, well, the relations are bad, why they thought so. And here we also have history as one of the options of answering the question. And here we see indeed the difficult historical experience is on the third place, named as an argument why the relations are bad. But once more, the different, this time the different economic interests are also quite high or higher than history today. That's, I think, also interesting for us. And the last, I think, the actually the most important question for our discussion today, but that stays really is very connected with the previous ones, is how history does influence of the Polish-German relations. And we this time we asked the question if the relations should rather focus or be on present issues or rather on the past. It was not if there should be more, what is more, it was rather what is more important, not that the history, the past should be forgotten or something. No, it was really stressed what should be the focus in the Polish-German relations, right? And here we see that both groups of respondents, I mean the Poles and the Germans, say yes, that's present and the future, what we should focus on in the Polish-German relations. We see that the answer, the past, here reach 36% of the Polish respondents and 19% of the Germans. Still, there are quite big groups, especially when you compare it with the previous answers. Here you see how the Polish opinions have changed recently. In the year 2011, much more Poles shared the opinion that that's the present and the future that you should focus on in the Polish-German relations. Now, the group of those who answered it's the past has really grown. On the German side, the differences are not so big. However, you can still see a small change. And so here a clear message. Yes, the history is suddenly much more important than it used to be years ago. I think that's an interesting point for our discussion after the presentations. And the last question that I wanted to share with you, it's a very complicated. So just concentrate. Let us concentrate. How was the question in wording? Have the suffering and the sacrifice experienced by the Polish people throughout their history been sufficiently recognized by the international public? So two things need to be stressed. International public, so it's not just in Germany or somewhere, but internationally, right? So Germany, US, Europe, all the countries are mentioned international, right? And recognize, so it doesn't mean that the question is about what the Poles feel. So it's not about the facts, because my colleagues have just presented how the experts presented the past and what were the debates, but it's not about the facts. The whole opinion polls studies, of course, about the perception. So what the Poles think, what they feel, what the heart says. And here we see really a big difference among Polish and German answers. Please notice the half of the asked Poles claim no, that has not been sufficiently recognized by the international public, when the majority of the Germans say yes, it was. It has been sufficiently recognized, so there is no problem. And of course, here we have also an issue when the Poles and the Germans talk about history, because the perception, how was it recognized, what the Poles suffered during the whole history, it was not just about the World War, is different. And we need to understand it when we analyze the historical debates and the also current discussions. This was just a very short presentation with the focus on history from the study. Those of you who want to read more are invited. It's all online, free of cost, on our webpage, the whole publication with the pictures, so you can read and analyze the answers deeper. It was just a very short presentation what we have researched, and I will stop here, and I'm happy and looking forward for the next discussions and analyzing together what the results really mean for the discussions on history today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these fascinating insights, and I really like that because it shows also why history is of importance, which as a historian I'm obviously convinced of. But we'll later come to that and we'll discuss what that actually means for German-Polish relations for our work here. But first we'll have the presentation by Hanna Radziejowska from the Pilecki Institute, Berlin. Please go ahead.
Hello, thanks a lot to all organizers for inviting me and the Institute. I was asked by Professor Lennstedt to tell something about our activities and also to try to answer on this question what the Germans should know. So I will try to answer on both questions. So yes, I'm the head of the Pilecki Institute in Berlin. This is a branch of research institute, a fairly young institution. We have been in Berlin for a year, and in Poland we operate on the basis of an act of law passed by the Polish Parliament, same, which established us 2 years ago, 2 years and a half ago. And of course, our aim is to study and reflect on the experience of the 20th century, and first and foremost on the Polish experience during the Second World War. And in this Polish means Polish citizens, a Polish state in this wider meaning. It's not national, so also before war, it's multicultural Polish, this meaning of cultural and political community. And our heart is the digital archive, which we built by digitalizing archival collections around the world. And thanks to this, the archives become available for Polish and foreign researchers and scholars. And this process of digitalization of collections, very diverse and often difficult to access. So it means it's all archives of course, in Germany, but also small archives in Poland, Great Britain, United States, Hungary, Czech, and around the world, in fact. So it's the basis of our activity, because access to archives is also a measure of democracy and democratization of knowledge, something like this. And another area of our activity is, of course, research programs and projects, seminars, conferences. We found scholarships, fellowships, of course, the publishing projects. Perhaps what distinguishes us from many different research institutes is our openness to culture and our awareness that history as a science covers very different areas of human experience. And that is why we take into account the perspective of the cultural world in our activities as a place where debate and dialogue about various events, moments in history can also take place at a deeper level. And a good example is our Polish-German Jewish Academy, Exercising Modernity. It's dedicated to history of modernism and modernity in 20s and 30s of 20th century. And of course, today reception of this idea, dreaming about modern future. And this project is, this academy is dedicated to German, Israel, and Polish artists and scholars. And this world of science and culture are spaces of freedom, places of debate and discussion of very difficult and sensitive subjects, which are so, I think, necessary nowadays to discuss. And we are also active in the area of education, this classical education, working with schools, students. And by education, we mean many activities. So, for example, this, of course, exhibitions, like our exhibition in Berlin about Witold Pilecki, who's co-curated by Jack Fairweather, a war correspondent to the Washington Post. It is Witold Pilecki, I recall, Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to Auschwitz to gather information and inform the world about the German crimes in Auschwitz and about Holocaust. And what is also important in this exhibition, Witold Pilecki, who built the resistance movement in concentration camp and was trying to destroy Auschwitz together with the Polish underground states and the Allies, but of course it's failed. And but exhibitions also about Lemkin, this author of the notion genocide or history of Polish women who gained the political rights in 1918. Like, for example, this week we'll have the presentation of the animation movie, doc movie about this story. Of course, our education activities are film productions, animation, participatory activities, and projects to commemorate and disseminate knowledge, and theater, and many others. And here you have some examples. Our last projects is this laboratory for documentary comic, is some photos from this Exercising Modernity Academy, our mural about Solidarność this August. And of course, in time of Corona, we are online all the time, like we all. And it's very interesting because last week we make some resume, and we discovered that this last month we did nearly 50 these open lectures, seminars, events, and nearly 5,000 participants, these individuals, took part in them, in this, all our events. Perhaps it's this, some examples about this, our education program for schools, for children also, some examples of our seminars for schools, and our education program is also, for example, the project that will be launched this February, I hope. So it's a game, computer game, click and point adventure format. It is based on archive in Schleswig-Holstein. It's a story about Heinz Reinefeld, who was responsible for massacre in Wola, of course, among many other crimes, during the Warsaw Uprising. It is first days of rising in Wola district. The German units, they murdered nearly 40,000 of Warsaw citizens. And the story that we decide to how we would like to tell the story, it's inviting young people to be a young prosecutor and who try to follow the Fritz Bauer and try to discover the facts. And what is, I think, will be very interesting in this game is that we use the archives and real testimonies, and the stories really based on facts. But of course, I would like also try to answer on this question, what Germans should know about history. So it's a part of the wider issue, the basic question of what Europeans, people around the world know and understand from Polish experience. And this question from which the idea of our institute was born, the question to which one of the answers was precisely this plan to build our diverse institution based on scientific and archival work, and hopefully international in action. And I would like recall this very interesting study on the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, carried out by Die Zeit in May this year. And this study was the questions that were asked, the Germans were asked, and it's very interesting, some of the answers, and I would like to show them. So we see that the 68% of respondents, they say that Germany has worked through Nazi time and could become a model for other countries. 77% say that accounting for Nazi times in the face of the latest developments has become as important as ever, and 58 rather or entirely agree that Germany is no more responsible for the NSDAP, wars, dictatorships, and crimes than other countries. What is very interesting, the 3% of respondents, they say that the grandparents formed the Third Reich, and 30% are convinced that their ancestors were opponents to Nazis. After all, the strength and violence of the Third Reich was built thanks to millions of committed military personnel, administrations and officials, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. So this is very interesting questions concern the so-called check line, Schlussstrich, in this study. 53% of Germans are demanding that the subject of the Third Reich should be closed. And one of the first thoughts that emerges is that 47 think differently and do not want this check line, and that still gives some hope. We in Poland, we live in the convictions that while we Poles started to build museums and tell stories after 1989, the Germans have been doing this systematically since the end of the war. And it's a very popular opinion. And we are catching up in such a not very fashionable way today. So meanwhile, the fact is that what I discovered, in fact, that all the important museum historical projects relating to the Second World War in Berlin were created in the last 10, 20 years. For example, the Wannsee House was established in 1992. Previously, it was a place of a children's colony, and there was not even any information about what happened here. It is not the Germans built museums, educated and taught in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They also started to do many things at the same time as Poland after this liberation from communism. So the Germans do not know about history of Poland a lot during the Second World War. That's a question, or what the Germans should know about history of Poland. And perhaps, do they want to know? Yes. And I think it's very perhaps too simple, but let us underline it is still about 6 million people murdered, of course, including and for most 3 million Polish Jews. And I think this reflection that people who did not have a chance to educate themselves, raise their children, work, build houses, cities, gather property, and so on, and these families experienced trauma after the war and this despair, of course, after the loss of their loved one, friends, and so on. And I think all of us living in Poland, somehow they feel these consequences to this day. I mean, in this psychological context, I mean, this trauma. And it turns out that few millions of people murdered, the country and the city destroyed. And the question is, do they seem worthy of the commemoration, but also something more? I mean, does the closest neighbor who is the author of this trauma is able to get this gesture, but I mean, in this meaning, gaining knowledge as a substitute for justice. And I think it's also very important that finally, let us add that the overwhelming majority of the perpetrators have never been punished for their crimes. For example, just 3 or 5% of crew, staffs of concentration and death camps were punished. So when we look at the micro histories in the villages or cities, like, for example, in the North Mazowsze, we'll not find anyone who was punished. I mean, when we look into the archives. So this, neither at the level of criminal justice nor at the level of this commemoration has the German state ever seriously faced the occupation of Poland. And I would like to make a short remark that all the memorials to the Second World War in Berlin are dedicated to minorities, to stateless people, and within them are commemorated all nationalities, including Germany. And each of the memorials and museums refers to the image of Germany's modern politics and values. So it is therefore part of the historical policy of the state, done without any hype and very naturally, and I think it's very interesting. But Professor Konkoleski Igor told something about this amazing initiative of German-Polish school book. And I would like to show you something, because I was trying to look into this German compendia preparing for the secondary school certificate in history. And I realized that this secondary school, this compendia, they doesn't discuss the course of the occupation of Poland during the Second World War, expect the date and cause of the outbreak of the war and the location of death camps and context of the extermination of European Jews. In the 8 school textbooks I have read, there was no mention of terror and crimes against the Polish intelligentsia, civilians, the Warsaw Uprising, the Polish underground state, the government in exile, and so on. I found one mention about the Home Army. And what is interesting, Polish Jews are not described as the separate group in any way. So in each of the textbooks, there is only a total number of 6 million murdered European Jews. As part of summary of all victims of Second World War, the group and categories of victims are listed, like 500,000 Sinti and Roma, 100,000 Germans victims of euthanasia, 9 million soldiers killed, 3 million prisoners of war, 2 million Soviet Jews, thousands of civilians, or many millions of Soviet civilians. In another school book, alongside the victims of Sinti and Roma, there are the following groups: Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, and there is one group, Polish and Soviet civilians, with a total of 2.5 million. This means that a German high school graduated will not find out that Poland has lost 6 million of its citizens in total, including 6 million Polish Jews. And this description of the Second World War, which emerges from the German textbooks for this secondary school certificate, so it means this is Sekundarstufe 2. Yeah? Apart from presenting the chronological course of events of the whole war, focuses on 2 subjects: the Holocaust, and what is very, very interesting, the history of the German resistance movement against the Third Reich. I will give you an example from one of these compendiums covering the years 1815, 1945. In this 335-page book, 54 lines of text are devoted to the Polish subject, which briefly present the history of Poland from the 18th century to 1939, as well as the borders in 1945, and with this information about expulsion of the Germans from today's Polish Western lands. A proportion of 20 pages devoted to the history of the Holocaust, from the Nuremberg trial to the post-war debates of historians in Germany, while 13 pages are devoted to a detailed discussion of German resistance groups against the Third Reich. There is only one example in the material discussing the issue of rescuing Jews: Oskar Schindler, a German fabricator, which is described in half a page of the textbook. In another of the textbooks, in which there are analogous proportions and selections of material, on the map presenting the new borders of the countries in Europe after 1945, there is this large description, reparation on the drawing of the Western lands of the Polish Republic. And the German textbooks discuss the subject of total war, Vernichtungskrieg, and its consequences, but appear only in the context of the Third Reich attack on the Soviet Union in June 41. And the school textbooks note the crimes against civilians in occupied Europe, such as this French Oradour, 450 people shot, and the Czech Lidice, 173 people. And there is no mention here of burning and murdering Polish villages, several hundred, the tragic fate of Zamojszczyzna, or even this genocide in Warsaw Wola district, mentioned, these 40,000 people murdered in 3 days. I will recall this year's discussion in Germany on commemorating the Polish victims of the German occupation in Berlin. Many German scholars and politicians protested against such a monument and raised the harmful dimension of nationalizing memory, creating a situation of victim competition. Statements of this kind highlighted the danger of telling a story from the national perspective. This approach is particularly surprising in view of the strictly national German perspective of the content of the school textbooks for this secondary school certificate. This is particularly evident when we're discussing the chapters on resistance to the Third Reich, where there is only this description of German opposition groups. After reading these textbooks in general, I'm no longer surprised that so many Germans believed that their grandparents were active in the resistance movement, is 30%, and so few of them believed that their ancestors formed the Third Reich, 2%. Polish history and experience from 20th century shows that it is totalitarian systems that take away memory and erase history, like Witold Pilecki history, Jan Karski, Jana Sendler, people who rescued Jews, underground state history, and many others. Also, these very controversial, difficult, and completely not heroic, like these anti-Semitic stories. One of the key elements of building democracy, what we call European values, is precisely memory and history. These are two different things, but linked. And learning and understanding history is one of the most important ways of preserving a democratic society. And this second thing, there is no reconciliation without history. There is no reconciliation without memory. And saying that history and memory are unnecessary sounds like repeating values from these undemocratic systems, which thought that it was possible to construct a human being and a world without placing them in a coherent continuum. Democracy requires a certain consistency and relationship with what happened. And I think it is impossible to build this present world without this sense of justice. I mean, what is, I think, also in history, and talking about the past is as a substitute for justice. And looking at what is happening on the eastern border of the Republic of Poland, I mean, Belarus, Ukraine, we should be aware that this freedom and democracy are never given once and for all. And this historical awareness protects us from evil, yes. And I think it's somehow it's about Poles, that Poles should not allow themselves to be persuaded that they are the only ones dealing with history, because the opposite is true. We all deal with history, and the Germans too. And yeah, thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for showing your work that you're doing here in Berlin, obviously as part of the much larger Pilecki Institute that also operates in Poland. So if I should sum up this discussion, then I would say we've heard a lot about research on German crimes committed in Poland, about the possibilities to learn about German-Polish history, and we've heard about German and Polish feelings towards this history, and in one sentence we clearly can sum this up as not all is well. German-Polish history is a problematic field, especially when we talk about the Second World War. Problems, however, need to be addressed and analyzed, even if there's probably not the one solution. Daniel, you have shown that there's quite a lot of research on crimes in Poland, but there are also different national interests by scholars and actually schools of historiography. And of course, it's perfectly legitimate to have different perspectives on history. This actually constitutes scholarship. But in many ways, I have the impression that there actually is a problem in lacking mutual research questions and mutual research interests. But why is this the case? And how can we come to a truly integrated historiography? These, of course, are academic problems, but there is also the problem of communicating research. And Igor showed us how, in a way, your school book gives an answer to the question of how to address German-Polish history. School books canonize knowledge, and in the end, they present a consensus about what is relevant. And here, this is a scholarly consensus, and I really love your work because it goes way beyond national history. But to address the elephant in the room, is my information correct that your book, unfortunately, is rarely used in schools, both in Poland and Germany? Because then, as what is taught in schools is usually a political decision, wouldn't this lead to the conclusion that a mutual view of German-Polish history is of little relevance for our societies? Hanna Radziejowska's Pilecki Institute gives an answer to the question of which aspects of Polish-German history they consider important. And Pilecki Institute is communicating Polish history of the 20th century in Berlin via an exhibition, via research funding, via conferences, publications, even an online computer game. This is cultural diplomacy in Germany and for Germans, with a focus on crimes committed against Poland. But, Pani Hanno, how would you define a success of your institute? Is there a point where you could eventually say, mission accomplished? So, for instance, when the opinion surveys you showed us, or the opinion surveys like the one Agnieszka Wada told us, would show different results, and what results would you wish for? And finally, to ask a question to Agnieszka Wada, you just told us that Germans and Poles still identify history as a problem for mutual relations, and it's actually a growing number that see a problem here. But on the other hand, a majority thinks that there are more important problems than the past. And although I'm a historian and deeply convinced that history is of relevance, I'd buy into that perception. There are probably more important problems than the past. But wouldn't your results in the end imply that politics of history are overemphasized and potentially overfunded? And on the other hand, does your research give any indication of how we could improve our mutual relations? I mean, it's obviously not by leaving the past behind, but it's also not the future alone. What could be a solution? What do your respondents tell you? I must say, before you have the opportunity to speak, we have a Q&A forum that is on your Zoom client for the audience, where you can answer questions. And some of you are already using it, and we will try to answer these questions either in writing directly to you, or if these questions are, if we still have time, we'll also put them to an open forum here, and I will read them aloud. But please go ahead, dear audience, please go ahead and write your questions. And now the panelists, I don't know who wants, if you want to address, who wants to address the questions, who wants to go ahead.
So I can maybe start. Thank you for the question. I mean, indeed, well, I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and I of course agree with you with your personal view that currently the history shouldn't play the most important role in bilateral relations or international relations. But as I also stressed, introducing the question that we asked, it is that we want to exactly stress that the past should be remembered. You should talk about it. You should research on that, and still the majority shares this opinion, right? That's the future and the present that should be in focus of the Polish-German relations. My reading of the results is that it's all mostly also caused by the running discussions in Poland, or what is the focus of the Polish public debate currently. History is very stressed in the running debates, and I don't think it's generally bad to concentrate on the history, but you need to have a balance. And some experts, some media focus too much on the history when they write, they inform about Germany. So it's a kind of responsibility that the elites have, what you focus on, what you show to the public. And indeed, we have so many current challenges. I mean, not just right now the pandemic, but other issues in the European Union in the security issues, that you shouldn't only see the other partner, in this case Germany, through your historian glasses, right? So here I would say that's important that the public debates in both countries are not just focused on the past. That's what we can do. But of course, and the last question that I showed you is an evidence for that. For the Poles, there is still this feeling what we have suffered is still not recognized enough. So from the German side and from side of the other countries, societies, it's good to know more about Polish history and show it and show this interest. So here, when I analyze the media or the debate, public debates, you can have this feeling. Well, in Germany, it's often or even more in France or in the US, that you don't know the Polish history, you don't know the Polish situation today, but you claim you know. And that's the worst thing that you can do, because Poles are here very sensible, but from the good reasons. And actually that's a recommendation for all of us. It doesn't matter for the Poles, Germans, or others. It's always good when you communicate to know the facts, not just to follow Twitter pictures and the stereotypes, but just show interest. And of course, even more if you cooperate, if you go to the country, if you have something in common with the partners from this country. So that can, answering your second question, that can improve relations, I believe. And the last thing, I think, also all the projects, all the initiatives that bring people together. We always asked, or not always, but very often ask the question in the study, have you ever been to Germany and to Poland? And those people who were, I mean, I now I say for the Germans who once were or a few times already have been in Poland, have a much better opinion and much more knowledge about Poland. So it shows, to improve the relations, the perception, the image of the country, but also the mutual understanding, you need to bring Germans to Poland, show them Poland, and bring Poles and Germans together. Now, of course, it's quite a challenge, as we see with this event, but it's still possible, even more possible, to not just for the Germans to come to Poland, but to discuss as we today international such issues. It's also kind of a meeting, even if not in person. So to support all such initiatives, it's crucial to improve the mutual understanding and the mutual relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to answer next? Igor, please.
Okay, so before I answer your question, Stefan, about the dissemination of our textbook in Germany and Poland, I'd like to ask still a question to Agnieszka Łada, to the questionnaires you're using for your polls. So are there any questions concerning the cultural exchange and transfer between our countries in relation to the past? This is my first question. So to put it quite simply, what do we owe to each other as far as histories are concerned? And if there are any questions, or you are perhaps planning to put these questions in the future into your questionnaires about positive aspects of Polish-German relations in the history. Because, well, naturally, our conference today is mostly on the Holocaust and the crimes of World War II. So one of the most tragic chapters in the history of Polish-German relations. But what we are trying to highlight in our textbook series was the fact that almost 500 years of Polish-German relations were actually without serious wars, without bigger political and military clashes. So let's say from the mid-14th until the mid-18th centuries. Is this any place in your questionnaires to ask questions like these?
Okay, maybe I will answer directly. Thank you, Igor. I mean, yes, I mean, maybe first the culture and generally other issues. We have some, every year we have a priority or a leading issue, and it's not always history. We want to focus on very different issues, politics, Europe. This time it will be pandemic, of course, because that's the issue in the Polish-German relations as well. So it's of course very difficult to ask all the questions that you would like to. We had something on that issues that you mentioned in previous years, culture or what you owe and so on. When you also understand culture and communication, how is the exchange of knowledge also in the cultural field, we did ask such question this year. If you watch German television, if you watch German films or Polish films, if you read books of Polish authors, so you can find the numbers in the newest publication from this year. And just to summarize the answers, the answers show very clearly that the interests are even lower than years ago. So low. Not so many Germans or not so many Poles as in year 2000 or 2005 or 6 read books or watch films from the other country. So they are very current issues, I would say. But coming to history and positive aspects, it would be, of course, very interesting. But sometimes when we need to take the decision which questions we should add, it's a very detailed question. So for a rather detailed study on Polish-German relations and history, it would be perfect. But it's an important point, so I will take it with me. If you if we have some space in the questionnaire, it's indeed interesting, because I think indeed we need to also show the positive aspects, and we try to do so in the current, with the current issues. We ask for example, in which field of cooperation, the cooperation of Poland and Germany in the European Union would be the most important. So we also emphasize the positive aspects of cooperation, but here rather in the political issues. It's a good, interesting point. I will take it with me for the further studies. Why not? I agree it's important. Of course, then how we should ask it is another question, but thank you for the idea.
Okay, so thank you, Agnieszka, for your readiness to take these questions with you. And now, Stefan, I'm going back to your question about the dissemination of the possible dissemination of our textbook in teaching history in our both countries. So, as a matter of fact, the whole series, Europe of our history, is still going through reviewing procedures at the Ministry of Education in Poland. And we expect that the approval will be given only at the end of this year, and only from this point on, so practically starting from the next school year, 2021-2022, it will be possible to use the Polish language version in Poland in teaching history in a classroom. But the situation is a bit different in Germany, since all volumes have been already approved for using in teaching history at school, except for one Bundesland, except for one region in Germany, where we didn't ever get any approval, and this is Bavaria, this is Bayern. And just the explanation for this fact was that we did not include enough regional Bavarian history into the textbook of Europe of our history. So, nonetheless, the problem is that teachers and schools also in Germany are able to use the 4 volumes, would be able to use the 4 volumes only after the final volume has been published. And it happened, as I said, only 4 months ago, so in the summer 2020. Nevertheless, we started a promotion of our project, of our textbook among teachers in Poland and in Germany as well. So 2 years ago, we established a working group, Arbeitsgruppe, Grupę Roboczą, by the joint Polish-German textbook commission. The group is composed of about 25 teachers from Poland and Germany, and they meet regularly. At the normal time, there were just regular traditional workshops we organized in different places, here in Berlin at the Center for Historical Research, or in Poland, among others at the Museum of, at the European Center of Solidarity. And we focused mostly on testing some selected chapters from volume 4 in a classroom in Poland and Germany. And it was made by the members of the working group. And they also, basing on some selected chapters, are working still now, having online meetings on some lesson plans, how practically to put the knowledge which is included in chapters in our textbook into teaching history in a classroom. So the textbook is being tested now in both countries, but still is not being disseminated as much as we hope it will be in the future.
Thank you. I must say I was just laughing when you were talking about Bavaria. I went to school in Bavaria, and I'm hardly surprised that they push for more Bavarian history in a Polish-German textbook. I have, Igor, by now, I have two questions here that actually are both linked to school textbooks. The one textbook is, the one question is whether the lobbyism of the German expellees, these organizations who very much pushed to show forced migration only via the East German example, in what way they succeeded, or in what way your textbook also shows, for instance, the Polish experience. That's one question. And the other question is, as we just heard or have seen the example on existing German textbooks by Hanna Radziejowska, here's the question how this looks in Polish textbooks. It's probably a second lecture you could give to answer these questions. And we really have, we're already nearing to the end. So if you can keep it short, because the other two panelists, there are still two panelists who want to answer also, I would be grateful.
Okay. So to put it briefly, I would say that, well, Polish and German curricula are in this respect, as far as World War II is concerned, are different. But they started to be mainly different after 2004, after the educational reform was introduced in Germany. Because before this date, before 2004, we would be able to find much more textbooks for history, school textbooks for history, covering very systematically World War II, the terror and occupation of the Nazi Germany in different European countries, including Poland. So there was much more space for this topic in the books which appeared before 2004. After 2004, two main focuses. So the so-called Volksgemeinschaft and the Holocaust are dominating in the content of the textbooks. As far as the first question is concerned, I'm not quite sure if I understood it completely. So would you be able to repeat the question? Because this is a question about the influence of the other environments, so to say, on our textbook. If there were any pressure.
Yeah, no, not so much on your textbook, but in what way they pressurized other textbooks and had their influence in other textbooks, and you, in a way, corrected a picture.
Okay, I see. Yeah, well, there were many such examples, not necessarily related to the 20th century. But as far as the 20th century is concerned, I guess that the most important issue was that we presented in our textbook the dimension of the Soviet occupation on the Polish territories in the wake of the Soviet aggression from the 17th of September 1939. And we tried to present also the atrocities of the Soviet occupation on the Polish territories, but also on the territories of the Baltic states. And this is something which hardly appears in the German textbooks.
Thank you. So we have Hanna Radziejowska, we have Daniel Breving. Daniel, Hanna, who wants? Daniel already turned on his camera, so go ahead.
Yeah, Stefan, you asked me about the possibilities of an integrative perspective, synthesizing the different approaches, perspectives on Nazi violence in occupied Poland. And this actually touches upon a topic which is quite pressing to me, because we don't actually have a synthetic study on German occupation policy in Poland. The last one we have was written by Czesław Madajczyk half a century ago, and there's not a new there never has been a new approach to synthesize different research perspectives. I don't know why that is the case. It might have something to do with a general postmodern aversion against master narratives. I don't know, but in anyhow, I think what is important is to take serious the provocation by the new school of Polish, the so-called new school of Polish Holocaust historiography, because what they do is they kind of transcend. They paint a new picture of everyday life under German occupation, and they transcend this rigid dichotomy of occupiers and occupants. And I think this is very, very, very important, and adds a layer of nuance to our understanding. That's the one thing. On the other hand, I think it is problematic at times if we ask about those contact zones, about zones of interaction between German police forces and Polish peasants, for example. If we ask questions of Polish cooperation in these cases, without addressing the basic conditions that were shaped by the German occupiers. So I think any synthetic approach would have to kind of like integrate both the provocations and these basic conditions that don't have anything to do with sentiments of Polish peasants or Polish society in general, but that were shaped by Nazi policy, and which kind of like set the frame in which Poles actually acted. And so this I think this is something that needs to be reflected and should be integrated in a future synthetic study that I just hear is in the making.
So I have very short answer because the question about what does it mean mission accomplished, I think it's our presence in Berlin. It's not only an invitation to the German audience to learn about Polish Eastern European history, but it's also a challenge for Polish side to get to know this new perspective on Polish history. And I think it's when there is a dialogue and discussion. So what does it mean, the success, success in dialogue and discussion? Yeah? So I think the discussion itself and this openness to this mutual listening is a success. So that's my answer. It's very difficult today to see this future. We are 1 year in Berlin. We are a very young institution, and I think this process is what is the success.
Thank you. Yeah, a success. I think you definitely have some success. At least, I mean, you have a lot of success, but I think a particular success is your exhibition that you are currently showing, and I find this is a great project to have your own permanent exhibition here. I would like to raise here one question that is also from the audience, and this is it's a question that somehow probably goes to the wrong persons here, because the question is about whether this is just a German-Polish problem, or whether this is also a problem, for instance, between Austria and Poland, whether this is the lacking context, the lacking historization, and whether the interconnection of the Holocaust with other crimes is something that not only for the Polish case is lacking. So, for instance, if we should also well, have a wider approach and integrate like Soviet crimes, whether it's possible to reduce, well, to reduce German crimes of World War I to only the crimes in Poland, or whether we need an approach that in general is open, is much more open and goes beyond the national perspective. I don't know who can address that, especially with the question for Austria, but I think yeah, it's an interesting question to me as well, but I have no idea how the case in Austria is.
Can I, sorry, I'm also not able to answer this specific question, but can I go briefly back to your last question about the textbook, which I'm afraid I misunderstood. So it was about how far we took into account the German textbooks and the German didactic tradition into our textbook. So just a brief answer. Well, we owe to the German didactic tradition taking over into our textbook something which is completely new for the Polish didactic. So the multi-perspective approach and the principle of controversiality of the primary sources we put into our textbook. And I guess that this is one of the most important things we were able to accomplish, this borrowing of some very interesting principles which are deeply rooted in the German didactics, and put it into our joint Polish-German textbook. In this way, we can enrich also the Polish didactics on history. Thank you.
I think this is, thank you very much for the answer. And I think that, well, part of the solution is not only having a mutual textbook, but also having the discussions about the textbook, the scholarly discussions in advance, and then hopefully this textbook will not only be used by schools, but also be discussed. I mean, I find this is a fantastic project that could really set examples not only for the German-Polish context, but the idea and the concept could be used for many other nations as well. Well, we are actually at the end of our time, and I'm grateful that you kept your last answers so short. And I would like to thank you for this discussion. I've learned a lot. I found it fascinating. I'm also very grateful that you answered questions also in writing and directly to our audience. And to the audience, we will now have a lunch break, and I will see you, hopefully, we will see you again in an hour at 1 p.m., 13 Uhr deutsche Zeit, and we will continue with legal aspects of German crimes in Poland. So we will continue the discussion with yet another disciplinary perspective. And also we have colleagues from Poland and Germany. So I hope to see you. And well, I think Tal will now end our session, right? Is that correct?